from Bridgeport, Connecticut. I'm at the Knowlton Mills. It's a beautiful afternoon and we're on the water here. I wish I could join you today in Australia, but thank you for this wonderful opportunity to share some ideas remotely about the future of the public realm and the capacity of abandoned urban spaces to build cultural and ecological wealth. Again, I'm at the former manufacturing site on the Paquonic River in Bridgeport, Connecticut, on the territory of the Pagosset, who cared for this land and who were forcefully removed from it without regard to culture, practice, nor livelihood. The river that was once the backbone of their life became the backbone of another life, a colonial settlement powered by industry to support its growing population, first whaling, then manufacturing, all dependent on this river. On this site, at the Armstrong Manufacturing Company, they built many, many things of metal, wrenches, pipe fittings, and notably, in the 1890s, the first hybrid electric car. Armstrong was one of many factories. Upriver was the Berkshire Mills, downriver Wheeler and Howes coal yards, just to name a couple. In fact, this city, located on the northern shore of Long Island Sound, connected by rail and highway to New York City just 100 kilometers to the southwest, and Boston, nearly 250 kilometers to the northeast, was a manufacturing mecca. To quote a recent New York Times article, the city turned out so many things, it seemed to be almost single-handedly shaping the habits of modern life. Rolling off the assembly lines, lipstick cases, flashlights, typewriters, fans, underwear, sewing machines, cars, scissors, guns, lace, drills, helicopters, phonograph records. It's no wonder. The city has the longest shoreline in Connecticut, at just over 40 kilometers, a shoreline that, as practices have shifted, is dotted with past and present brownfield sites and industrial uses. It is, and always has been, one of the city's greatest assets. But what is its future? Let's pause here and zoom out, as we could argue that nearly every city has industries that have migrated to leave behind toxic scars, that nearly every city has wilds that have formed along underutilized infrastructural corridors, that nearly every city has vacant parcels, that nearly every city has implemented policies that have led to harm and injustice. Marginalized communities, as a result, have more vacant land, are more likely to flood, have fewer trees, are hotter, have more exposure to toxins, and on and on. I'm here to talk about how the spaces that we've jettisoned can be the spaces that we repair, with human and non-human agency to address our climate emergency. In other words, I'm here to talk about how to bring people and life back to spaces that we've abandoned, how to work collectively to unbuild in the places we have harmed, and how, in this unbuilding, to foster ecological and social wealth. So this is the Paquonic River that I've been talking about, and then the goal is along this riverway and waterway, but also around the harbor, to have a connected trail where people would have access to the water. But you can sort of see, especially as you look across, there's all this potential and open space, but there's really no way for the kind of public to interface with the water or to kind of engage with the water on the one hand. And similarly, the hard edge doesn't provide any kind of mitigation against a flood event or a storm surge. So even though we're a considerable ways from the mouth of the harbor, you still get storm damage up this hard. So you could imagine a kind of reconfiguration of this waterfront, both for human access. People love to fish. People love to walk. There's no shade to move along it. Things that would allow for a kind of meaningful engagement with the water are lacking. These are all private properties, so that would require trespassing to get across. And then from an ecological standpoint, the edge has really been hardened, so you're not able to absorb water. You're not able to kind of mitigate against flood events. You aren't seeing a kind of vibrant habitat. So it's a prime example where there is space, there's a chance to engage, but that opportunity hasn't reached its full potential, or maybe any of its potential at this point. Abandoned property has long vexed cities, especially the architects, landscape architects, urban designers, planners, and citizens living and working in them. In the past few decades, hundreds of ideas for abandoned property have emerged. Some remain purely speculative, while others have been tested and implemented. Meanwhile, neither the preoccupation with nor the accruement of abandoned property has abated. These fallow landscapes are everywhere, and everywhere they're distinct. The goal is, first, to convey their idiosyncratic potentials, to look intently at the present lived condition as a reflection of a complex past, to imagine an equally rich and varied future. In many of these examples, it is a matter not so much of making drastic change to the sites themselves as drastically reimagining how we approach and care for them. From Fallow, a book and love letter to the landscape and the ways in which we inhabit space, is part documentation, part imagination. It's a trove of ideas based on over a decade of observation of abandoned urban landscapes. So let's pause on a few that resonate with the Bridgeport context in which we find ourselves today. Most directly, the graffiti gallery and mural, but also the skate park, for which there are plans underway with the wonderful organization Skateport, and the food trucks and picnic areas that brought temporary life to the sliver by the river, just downriver, for a block party last May. These actions and design bring people and life to the river, but admittedly, there's much more to be done. Bridgeport, like many coastal cities, faces flooding threats that are only growing with time. First Street, a nonprofit dedicated to providing data tools that connect climate and financial risk, have classified Bridgeport's risk as major. By the numbers, there are over 9,000 properties in Bridgeport at risk of flooding over the next 30 years, representing nearly 1/3 of all properties in the city. Unsurprisingly, these properties are close to the river and harbor, on the sites of current and former industry, like the ones we are standing on today. And Bridgeport, again like many cities, is not only prone to flooding, but it's also hot and getting hotter. Here, again, a major risk, and one that is not felt uniformly across the region. This is due to the physical and material characteristics of the built environment. Certain neighborhoods have more paving and less shade than others, and therefore experience greater surface temperatures on hot days. At the census tract level, this is evident. In aerial imagery, this is evident. And now, with more data being collected, at the site level, this is evident. Just to drive the point home, here, again, a study of urbanized areas across the entire Northeast United States by McDonald et al. In 2021 found the Stamford-Bridgeport area to be the place with the greatest difference in tree cover between low and high income blocks. It's a staggering 54% difference. This is a strong correlation, and of course not accidental, but a result of systemic injustice and racist policies that have led to differential levels of care and investment both within the city and across the region. Bridgeport is at the mouth of the Pequannock River, the downstream neighbor of some of the wealthiest places in the entire country. Thus, a regional approach is paramount as we work collectively to undo harm. So with this urgency for action, let's pull some more ideas, ones that address the capacity for public landscapes to absorb water, chemical elements, and heat. Plant it is one of the most elemental of these ideas, and while plants are not a panacea, and while plants require care and compassion, they also engage with water, nutrient, and energy cycles to soak up, sequester, and cool. To take this last point, while there is not a known one-to-one relationship for trees planted and degrees cooled, it is evident that connected canopies cool cities. The more contiguous the cooling landscapes, the cooler the city. So, connect it. And with planted corridors, cities may be able to address toxicity through phytoremediation, positively interact with the carbon cycle through sequestration, build habitat for flora and fauna alike, and mitigate flooding with wet meadows and wild landscapes in at-risk areas. In a sense, these ideas are all forms of nature-based solutions, things I'm sure you've heard of, but can be defined as actions that incorporate ecological processes to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and care for modified ecosystems to address socio-environmental challenges while providing measurable benefits to people and the environment. They're forms of what the landscape architect Kate Orff called unbuilding, and now, more than ever, unbuilding is in our common interest. Radical unbuilding. The ideas in From Fallow start with the idea of doing nothing, which is a provocation of sorts, of course, as so much needs to be done. But do the landscapes that we've abandoned and left to their own undoing offer more habitat and less harm than the ones we actively design? I don't know the answer to this question, but it brings up a series of questions of how can we do without doing too much? How can we do without causing future harm? And how can we do to undo the immense harm we've done? So at this point, we've covered the what, to conceive public landscapes of the future, the where, on abandoned landscapes of the past, and the why, to address climate and social equity, leaving us with perhaps the hardest question, the how. The architect and theorist Julia Czerniak asks this very question in the afterword of the From Fallow collection, rightly demanding for instrumentality. She writes, "So what comes next? Certainly, it is to focus passionately, not simply on what to do, but how to get it done. Hinted at in the volume's index, which provide a sense of the cost, labor requirements, maintenance regimes, and completion time associated with each approach, what comes next is the hard work of a reimagining fallow terrain within the particular economic, ecological, social, and political conditions of a city. What matters next is moving this project forward by navigating the relationship between precise design proposals and the local conditions, working within this triad of ambition, to envision, to enable, to pay, that will require a myriad of talent and expertise. For example, architects, landscape architects, planners, urbanists, graphic designers, real estate developers, leaders of not-for-profits, local government officials, and most notably the community who know so much about the history and legacy of their land. Through the agency of this group, and many others depending on the place and project, we will move towards the assembly of what matters most, the collection of hundreds of sites that have fully and potently realized their potential. To be instrumental is to learn and listen, engage, dig deep, be deliberate, be mutualistic, and as is being argued for today, to find common interest. So while From Fallow is quick, a second book project, Cyclical City, examines shifting urban landscapes over long time cycles, uncovering dramatic shifts in the landscape that can be both singular and episodic. It argues that history matters and that the past and present actions and policies have played a fundamental role in producing and sustaining abandonment. It also counters the notion that change is unidirectional towards advancement and progress, and debunks myths that seek to generalize geographic and temporal situations. It looks at patterns of growth and decline and their periodic and potentially repetitive nature, and reveals the emergent properties of the shrinkage landscape, or the resultant landscapes of economic change. In other words, the aspiration is to see beyond these frames, myopic 60-year comparisons of then and now, views that despite all the rich ideas available, seem hard to shake. These views force us back to a particular moment, a singular baseline with an economically biased view of what is desirable. The goal is not to fill again with buildings, but rather to, in the words of theorist Bruno Latour, to understand how best to mutate. In Facing Gaia, Latour says, and I quote, "It doesn't stop. Every morning it begins all over again. One day it's rising water levels. Next, it's soil erosion. By evening, it's the glaciers melting faster and faster. On the 8 p.m. news, between two reports on war crimes, we learn that thousands of species are about to disappear before they've even been properly identified. Every month, the measures of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are even worse than the unemployment statistics. Every year, we are told that it's the hottest since the first weather recording stations were set up. Sea levels keep on rising. The coastline is increasingly threatened by storms. As for the ocean, every new study finds it more acidic than before. This is what the press calls living in an era of ecological or climate crisis. Alas, talking about a crisis would just be another way of reassuring ourselves, saying that this too will pass. The crisis will soon be behind us. If only it were just a crisis. If only it had been just a crisis. The experts tell us we should be talking instead about a mutation. We were used to one world. We are now tipping and mutating into another. To consider a longer time frame and a halt to the unidirectional notion of growth and progress that is part of that old way of being in this world is to dive deep and wide. For this, both plurality, as seen in the From Fallow work, and specificity, as found in Cyclical City, which looks at 5 cities over long time periods, is necessary. In other words, to put it simply, there's no one answer, and what might work for one place might not work for another. So be wary of magical elixirs or colonizing imports. Thus, to inject other histories into that aerial slider we saw of then and now, to question the preoccupation with the figure ground and other limiting binaries, allows us to understand and work within the unique properties, the DNA, if you will, of cities, sites, and their contexts. We must unearth long stories that extend from the distant past to the near future and that trace the specific material properties of making and unmaking, to ground and test ideas, to know how to do and who and what to connect. We must see landscapes through the formation, tangible and intangible, of individual sites as they move through these cycles of building and unbuilding, from the overall framing of the urban spaces down to their material constitution. The work foregrounds the specific affordances of the site itself, looking at the key materials, the rudiments that come together to enable life. This means that every project and city can be understood through specific and critical lenses. To take a city from the book, Philadelphia, a city where I lived for many years and the place that really got me thinking about urban abandonment, with its ridges and valleys and its grid cut by diagonals that trace old trails. The primary lens is water. Philadelphia is one of several eastern U.S. cities built on the fall line, where geologic provinces transition and waterfalls or rapids occur along riverways. And while many cities are marked by their hydrological conditions, the history of Philadelphia and its tens of thousands of vacant parcels can be explained through its water management practices. For example, the building of sewers along underground creeks contributed to the subsequent subsidence and abandonment at the surface. Years later, these fallow lands are open for the management of stormwater and localized flooding through nature-based solutions. Philadelphia elected to meet its EPA stormwater mandates with green infrastructure rather than piping, and is constructing basins throughout the city. The story is, of course, much more complicated and intricate, but this gives a sense of the argument. And in another city from the book, St. Louis, literally built on and from clay and limestone beneath its streets, is a place where racist policies like slum clearance, redlining, urban renewal, and highway building clearly contribute to the landscape of abandonment. In the place that historian Walter Johnson calls the broken heart of America, 5 major interstate highways gash through the fabric, like blood-draining arteries, their scars clearly visible on a map of the city's vacant land. The national significance of the racist underpinnings fuel art and protest, marching along these highways, taking them back, if momentarily. It is here that the Black Lives Matter movement gave momentum after the murder of Michael Brown 10 years ago this past August. And while these are just 2 examples, think to the places that you know and what environmental properties, marshy confluence, limestone substrate, and infrastructural promises, piping, rail, highways, and cultural practices, mound building, rotational farming, blues, hoagie, protest, underlie. With this foundation, the argument then is for another plot line, for the potential of aggregation and transformation, and the ability to empower and build communal wealth through local knowledge and spatial design. The design approach and methodology confront histories of colonization and systemic failure to see the importance of reciprocal change and the particularities of context. While arguably our world-making endeavors are relatively small, we can still push for valuation and visions that honor and keep places and push back on rigid baselines and singular political and economic regimes. To see the labor of ecology, to value the chicory and wild carrot and sumac found in places of abandonment, and to see the labor of people, not through exploitation, but through respect and compensation. It requires a move away from capital and ownership of the framings of nature's capital and ecosystem services towards thinking about how the idea of the non-human owning its own labor brings forth notions of a human and non-human collectivity. To push these alternative value systems, we can look to the cycles, systems, hybrids, and gradients that allow us to break free of binaries and linear narratives. As planners and designers, we tend to think in binaries, then or now, public or private, cultivated or spontaneous, mown or not mown. But this too has considerable limitations. What if projects are conceived of as gradients, and along those gradients, resources are deliberately allocated to the maximum social and ecological impact? What if pause, instead of being stagnant, brings new formation? What if pause allows the time necessary to support and empower, question and demand, disrupt and reorder? What if our work, instead of aiming for totality, embraces the incomplete, the evolving, the wild, and the collective? These seem like fruitful questions to think about both the future of our abandoned landscapes, as well as about the lessons past abandonment might have for future climate-driven abandonment within this frame of regenerative cycles. Let's come back to the future of Bridgeport and its waterfront, and let's recall some of our facts. Bridgeport's downstream. It's an environmental justice community surrounded by some of the wealthiest suburbs in the country. It has the longest shoreline in the state of Connecticut at just over 40 kilometers. It's hot, it's floods, and the sea level and air temperatures are only rising. But the waterfront has been parceled out, hardened, and rendered inaccessible over time. About 70% of it's privately owned, and the local community wants to do something about this. So there's an ambitious movement underway to develop a 30-kilometer long pathway that will line the city's waterways and shorelines, that will link 9 of Bridgeport's 13 neighborhoods, connecting residents to the water in a meaningful way. Nearly 40,000 people, a third of whom identify as Black and nearly half of whom identify as Hispanic, live within a 10-minute walk of the proposed pathway. Thus, it has incredible potential to vastly improve recreational opportunities, health, and the quality of life for Bridgeport's residents, while also mitigating flood conditions and coastal storm surge, providing maritime habitat for numerous species, and cooling the city. All right, so I'm standing on Waterview Avenue, where it crosses under I-95 above me. So that's I-95 that links Boston to the north, New York to the south with Bridgeport. And this is also the mouth of the Yellow Mill Channel. The Yellow Mill Channel is the next of the priority sites for the waterfront trail after Sliver by the River. We did a series of design charrettes and have now received funding for outreach, engagement, and preliminary design. The city owns a few parcels along this waterfront, which are deemed easy access points to bring the people to the river, and ultimately you'll be able to kind of access it, have fishing associated with this neighborhood, recreational opportunities. One of the sites is very close to a school. Another one is a park adjacent to residential. This is obviously at the mouth of the Yellow Mill, and so eventually you might be able to snake around from the Quannock to the harbor, kayak along the Yellow Mill, and ultimately reach Pleasure Beach further that way. So now we're just upstream a little bit, still on the Pequannock River. This is Knowlton Park. And Bridgeport, which I didn't mention before, is known as the Park City, so has tons of parks, but very few of them actually touch or engage with the waterfront. This is an exception. It's a relatively new park for the city from 2015, and it is an example where they've taken some formerly industrial land and provided access as a piece of the waterfront. So if you think about the waterfront trail map, there's these little segments of blue where the waterfront pathway has already been realized, and this is one of them. It's also a place where there's events. There's going to be kayaking here this Saturday. There's also sometimes painting or exercise. People love to fish here, and it's a rare chance where you actually get to be out close to the river on the water. We saw people biking a minute ago, so it's nice to imagine that someday you'll actually be able to bike all the way along the waterfront pathway and visit various sites as you progress. The project is a collaboration between the City of Bridgeport, the Trust for Public Land, Groundwork Bridgeport, the National Park Service Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, the University of Connecticut Landscape Architecture Program, the Connecticut chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects, local designers, residents, and community groups, all working together to bring part of this vision to life. Engagement and empowerment drive the collective approach. Youth ambassadors do outreach. Local leaders work together incrementally to address needs and gaps. Events at places that are already assets like Seaside Park, an Olmsted and Vaux design from the late 19th century, or nearby Knowlton Park, a recent transformation, can pique interest, while events at soon-to-be public sites like Sliver by the River and Yellow Mill demonstrate potential and capacity. The group conducts walks and events, pointing to places where stormwater cascading from the highway above will be cleaned, to places where fishing and boating will be open to the public, to places where wetlands will slow flood intrusions, each parcel with a different role to play along the connected waterfront. Outreach and engagement feeds into community design charrettes, which support grant efforts, which allow for further design and engagement, which can lead to more grants towards the incremental realization of an ever-evolving waterfront pathway. The group is working within that triad of ambition, to envision, to enable, to pay, where the agency of the collective is enabling a set of landscapes to fully and potently address their potential, a common interest effort to bring social and ecological wealth and better fishing to Bridgeport's waterfront. It is forever a work in progress.